loyal canine German Shepherd, critically injured in the line of duty, lay on the brink of death. But what his police partner did next shocked everyone and changed their fate forever. This is a story of courage, sacrifice, and an unbreakable bond between a handler and his dog. Prepare yourself for a journey of resilience and redemption that will leave you speechless. The quiet night in the city was broken only by the occasional hum of passing cars. Officer Jake Reynolds, a 35-year-old veteran of the force with short black hair and piercing green eyes, sat in his patrol car with his canine partner, Shadow. Shadow, a black and tan German Shepherd with sharp amber eyes and an unmatched drive, had been Jake's partner for 5 years. They were inseparable, trusted by their precinct for handling the toughest calls. The radio crackled, and Jake's heart skipped a beat as dispatch relayed a report of a robbery in progress. All units, armed suspects reported at 12th and Elm. Proceed with caution. Jake grabbed the radio. Unit 27 responding. Shadow and I are on our way. As they arrived at the scene, Jake immediately noticed something was off. The streetlights were out, casting eerie shadows across the alley. Shadow let out a low growl from the back seat, his body tense and ready. You sense it too, huh? Jake said, opening the car door and releasing Shadow. They moved cautiously, Jake's hand on his firearm, Shadow walking a few steps ahead. The sound of shattered glass and hushed voices echoed from a nearby warehouse. Jake signaled Shadow to stay close as they approached the building. Suddenly, chaos erupted. Shots rang out, and Jake barely had time to dive behind cover. Shadow, trained to protect his handler at all costs, lunged toward the source of the gunfire. Jake shouted, "Shadow, no!" But the loyal dog was already in action, intercepting one of the armed suspects. The next few moments were a blur. Shadow took down the first suspect with precision, but before Jake could intervene, another gunman emerged from the shadows. A deafening gunshot filled the air, and Shadow let out a yelp that tore through Jake's heart. "Shadow!" Jake screamed, his voice cracking as he fired at the second suspect, neutralizing the threat. He ran to Shadow, who was lying on the cold warehouse floor, his side bleeding heavily. Shadow's amber eyes, once full of life, now flickered weakly as he looked up at Jake. Jake's hands trembled as he pressed them against Shadow's wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You're going to be okay. I promise." Backup arrived moments later, and the suspects were apprehended. Jake refused to leave Shadow's side as he carried him to his patrol car. Ignoring the flashing lights and chaos around him, he drove straight to the emergency veterinary hospital, his heart pounding with fear. "Hold on, Shadow," Jake said, his voice breaking. "I can't lose you." As they sped through the dark streets, Jake glanced in the rearview mirror, where Shadow lay in the back seat, his breath shallow but steady. Jake's mind raced with memories of their years together, their first training session, the countless lives Shadow had saved, and the bond they had formed. By the time they arrived at the hospital, Jake was shaking. The veterinary team rushed to the car, their faces serious as they saw Shadow's condition. "He's critical," one of them said, lifting Shadow onto a stretcher. Jake followed them inside, refusing to leave the waiting room despite their assurances that they would do everything possible. He paced the floor, his hands clenched into fists, replaying the scene over and over in his mind. An hour later, the lead veterinarian emerged, her face grim but not hopeless. "Shadow's injuries are severe," she said. "He lost a lot of blood, and the bullet grazed his lung. We've stabilized him for now, but the next 24 hours are critical." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "Can I see him?" The vet hesitated, then nodded. "He's sedated, but he'll know you're there." As Jake entered the recovery room, the sight of Shadow hooked up to machines nearly broke him. He knelt beside the stretcher, gently placing a hand on Shadow's head. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "You've got to fight. We've been through too much to stop now." Shadow's tail twitched faintly, and Jake let out a shaky breath. "That's it," he said, a small smile breaking through his tears. "You're not giving up, and neither am I." The sterile smell of the veterinary hospital filled the air as Jake sat in the corner of the recovery room, his head resting in his hands. Shadow lay on the stretcher nearby, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily, each sound a reminder that his loyal partner was still alive, but only barely. The vet's words echoed in Jake's mind. "The next 24 hours are critical." Jake glanced at Shadow, whose chest rose and fell with labored breaths. His black and tan coat was matted with blood, and a thick bandage covered the wound on his side. "You've always been the strong one," Jake said softly, leaning forward to rest his hand gently on Shadow's head. "I need you to fight, buddy. I can't do this without you." As the hours crawled by, officers from the precinct began trickling into the hospital, each of them carrying stories of Shadow's heroism. Officer Martinez, a young rookie, approached Jake with a small container of coffee in hand. "Shadow's a legend, you know," Martinez said, sitting beside him. "When I joined the force, they told me about the time he found those kids lost in the woods. You've got the best partner out there." Jake gave a faint smile, but didn't look up. "Yeah, I do. That's why he has to pull through. He's more than my partner. He's family." The hours dragged on, each one feeling like a lifetime. Around midnight, the lead veterinarian, Dr. Angela Hayes, entered the room. Her face was lined with exhaustion, but her eyes carried a glimmer of hope. "Shadow's stable," she said, her voice steady. "But his condition is still critical. He's responding to the transfusion, and we've managed to reduce the swelling around his lung. If he makes it through the night, his chances improve significantly." Jake exhaled, a mix of relief and tension washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Can I stay with him?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "Of course. He'll need all the encouragement he can get." Jake pulled a chair closer to Shadow's stretcher and sat down. As he gently stroked the dog's head, memories flooded back. Shadow bounding through the training course during their first day together, his tail wagging as if he knew he'd found his purpose. "You've saved so many lives, buddy," Jake whispered. "Now it's time for me to save yours." At some point during the night, Jake dozed off, his hand still resting on Shadow's paw. When he woke, the first thing he noticed was the faint twitch of Shadow's tail. Jake's heart leapt as he leaned closer. "Shadow?" he said softly. The dog's amber eyes flickered open, and, for a brief moment, their gazes met. Shadow's tail wagged weakly, and Jake let out a shaky laugh, tears streaming down his face. "That's my boy," he said, his voice breaking. "You're not giving up. I knew you wouldn't." Dr. Hayes entered the room, her expression softening as she saw the interaction. "This is a good sign," she said. "He's responding to your presence, Jake. Keep talking to him. It's clear you're his anchor." Over the next few days, Jake remained by Shadow's side, barely leaving the hospital. He worked with the veterinary team to assist in Shadow's recovery, helping with everything from feeding him to carefully supporting him as he tried to stand. Each small milestone, a wag of the tail, a flicker of alertness in his eyes, was met with quiet celebration. One evening, as Jake sat beside Shadow, he received a call from his precinct captain. "Jake, I just wanted to check in," the captain said. "How's Shadow doing?" "He's fighting," Jake replied, "just like always." "Well, the whole department is rooting for him, and when he's ready, we'll give him the hero's welcome he deserves." Jake smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." As he hung up, Jake looked at Shadow, who was resting but alert. "Hear that, buddy? Everyone's waiting for you. They know you're a hero." Shadow let out a soft huff, his tail wagging faintly. Jake chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. The road to recovery was still long, but Jake knew one thing for certain. Shadow wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for the bond they shared, the partnership that had carried them through countless challenges, and Jake would be there every step of the way. The morning sunlight poured through the large windows of the veterinary recovery room, casting a warm glow on Shadow's stretcher. Jake sat beside his partner, a cup of lukewarm coffee in one hand and his other hand resting gently on Shadow's paw. Days had passed since the shooting, and every small improvement in Shadow's condition felt like a monumental victory. Shadow's breathing was steadier now, no longer labored, and his amber eyes were more alert, though he was still too weak to move much. The faint wag of his tail whenever Jake spoke filled the room with hope. "You're a fighter, buddy," Jake said softly, leaning closer. "I knew you wouldn't let this keep you down." Dr. Hayes entered the room with a clipboard in hand, her expression lighter than it had been in days. "Good news," she said with a smile. "Shadow's vitals are improving steadily. He's not out of the woods yet, but if this progress continues, we can begin light physical therapy soon." Jake nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. You've done so much for him. The vet shook her head. It's not just me. Dogs like Shadow fight because of the bonds they share with their handlers. You're a big part of his recovery. Later that day, Jake decided to try something new. He had brought Shadow's favorite toy from home, a battered rubber ball with teeth marks from years of play. Holding it up, he knelt beside the stretcher. Remember this? Jake asked, his voice gentle. Shadow's ears twitched, and his eyes followed the ball. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with relief. He rolled the ball a few inches forward, and Shadow, with great effort, lifted his paw to touch it. That's it, buddy, Jake encouraged, his voice filled with pride. One step at a time. The veterinary team began incorporating small exercises into Shadow's routine. With Jake's help, Shadow was gently lifted onto his feet for a few seconds each day. The first time he stood, his legs trembled violently, and he collapsed almost immediately. Jake knelt beside him, stroking his fur. It's okay, Shadow. We'll try again tomorrow. Over the next week, Shadow's progress was slow but steady. Each attempt lasted a little longer. Each step was a little stronger. Jake remained by his side through every moment, encouraging him with quiet words and gentle touches. One afternoon, Officer Martinez stopped by with a surprise. Hey, Jake, he said, stepping into the room. I thought Shadow might need some extra motivation. He held up a framed photo of Shadow in his prime, standing proudly with Jake during a canine graduation ceremony. Shadow's coat was gleaming, his stance confident and strong. Jake smiled as he placed the photo on the table beside Shadow's stretcher. Thanks, Martinez. He'll be back to that in no time. Martinez grinned. No doubt about it. Everyone at the precinct is rooting for him. The next day, Jake decided to take Shadow outside for the first time since the incident. The veterinary team set up a small enclosed area where Shadow could feel the grass under his paws and breathe fresh air. Jake gently lifted Shadow and carried him outside, placing him on a soft blanket in the shade. Shadow sniffed the air, his nose twitching as the scent of flowers and trees filled his senses. You remember this, don't you? Jake said, sitting beside him. All those days we spent at the park, training and running drills. We'll get back there, I promise. With Jake's encouragement, Shadow pushed himself to his feet. His legs wobbled, but he stood for a full 10 seconds before lowering himself back down. Jake clapped softly, his smile beaming with pride. That's my boy, he said. You're amazing, you know that? As Shadow's strength grew, so did the bond between him and Jake. They had always been close, but this experience had deepened their connection in ways Jake hadn't thought possible. One evening, as they sat together in the recovery room, Jake looked at Shadow, his voice soft but firm. You've always been there for me, buddy. Now it's my turn to be here for you. Shadow let out a low huff, resting his head on Jake's lap. His eyes, though tired, were filled with trust and gratitude. Jake knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time since the shooting, he allowed himself to believe that they would come out stronger on the other side. The days blended into weeks, and Shadow's slow yet steady recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Jake had made the veterinary hospital his second home, dedicating every waking moment to his partner's care. The once frequent beeping of machines had been replaced with the soft sounds of Shadow's deep breaths and occasional tail wags, small victories that fueled Jake's hope. Shadow had grown stronger, his black and tan coat regaining its shine, though a thin scar ran along his side as a reminder of the night everything changed. Jake, always by his side, began integrating new exercises into their routine. Each small step, each attempt to walk, brought them closer to the life they once shared. On a crisp morning, Jake decided it was time for a bigger step forward. He convinced Dr. Hayes to let Shadow attempt his first walk outside the hospital grounds. He's ready, Jake said, his tone firm yet filled with hope. I'll be with him every second. Dr. Hayes hesitated, but eventually nodded. Just take it slow. He'll let you know what he's capable of. Jake gently clipped Shadow's leash to his collar, his heart pounding as they stepped out into the fresh air. The sun bathed them in a warm glow, and Shadow paused, his nose twitching as he took in the sense of the world outside. You ready, buddy? Jake asked, crouching beside him. Shadow's tail wagged faintly, and Jake smiled. That's the spirit. They began slowly, Shadow's steps unsteady but determined. Jake walked at his side, his hand ready to support him if needed. Each step felt monumental. a testament to Shadow's willpower and resilience. As they made their way to a small patch of grass, Shadow stopped and looked up at Jake, his amber eyes filled with a mix of trust and gratitude. Jake knelt, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "You're doing amazing," he said softly. Nearby, a family with 2 young children watched in awe. One of the kids, a boy no older than 7, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Look, Mom, that dog is so brave." The mother smiled, approaching cautiously. "Excuse me," she said. "Is it okay if we say hello? He looks like he's been through a lot." Jake hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, but go slow. He's still recovering." The boy crouched down, holding out his hand. Shadow sniffed it cautiously before nudging it gently with his nose. The boy's face lit up with joy. "You're a hero, aren't you?" he said softly. Jake's chest tightened as he watched the interaction. "Yeah, he is," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The moment seemed to reignite something in Shadow. His tail wagged more vigorously, and he stood a little taller, as if remembering the strength he once had. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That evening, back in the recovery room, Jake sat beside Shadow, reflecting on the day. "You've always had that effect on people," he said, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "You inspire them. You remind them what it means to fight." Shadow let out a soft huff, resting his head on Jake's lap. The room was quiet, but the connection between them spoke volumes. A few days later, Dr. Hayes called Jake into her office. "Shadow's progress is incredible," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "We've cleared him for light-duty training. It's up to you if you want to pursue it, but I think he's ready for the next step." Jake's heart raced as he glanced at the folder. "He's been through so much," he said. "I don't want to push him too hard." Dr. Hayes smiled. "Shadow's strength comes from his bond with you. If you're ready, he'll be ready too." That afternoon, Jake brought Shadow to the training yard for the first time since the incident. The space was familiar, filled with obstacles and equipment they had mastered together. Shadow's ears perked up as he recognized the environment, and Jake felt a surge of hope. "All right, buddy," Jake said, holding up Shadow's favorite ball. "Let's see what you've got." Shadow's steps were slow at first, but as Jake encouraged him, he began to move with more confidence. He weaved through cones, climbed over a low hurdle, and retrieved the ball with a triumphant bark. Jake laughed, tears streaming down his face as he knelt to hug Shadow. "That's my boy," he said, his voice breaking. "You're back." The vet staff watched from a distance, their faces lit with smiles. Shadow's journey wasn't just about recovery. It was about proving that resilience and love could overcome even the darkest moments. As the sun set over the training yard, Jake sat beside Shadow, the ball resting between them. "You've come so far," he said, his voice soft. "And we're just getting started." Shadow leaned into Jake, his tail wagging gently. The unspoken bond between them was stronger than ever, a testament to the power of loyalty and the lengths they would go for one another. Weeks passed, and Shadow's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The once critical Kane who had been fighting for his life was now a picture of resilience and determination. His steps grew stronger, his movements more fluid, and his eyes, those sharp amber eyes, were filled with purpose again. Jake couldn't help but marvel at his partner's progress. Every day was a testament to Shadow's unbreakable spirit, and their bond that had only deepened through the ordeal. Shadow wasn't just recovering, he was thriving. One morning, as Jake prepared Shadow for another session in the training yard, he received a call from Captain Avery. "Jake, I know you're still focused on Shadow's recovery, but we've got a situation," Avery said, his tone serious. "There's a missing child out near the state park. We've already got search teams out there, but—" "You need Shadow," Jake finished, his grip tightening on the phone. "We need the best," Avery replied. "But it's your call. If you don't think he's ready—" Jake glanced at Shadow, who stood by the door, his tail wagging faintly as he sensed Jake's determination. "He's ready," Jake said. "We'll be there." The state park was vast, with dense woods and rocky terrain that made the search difficult. Jake and Shadow arrived to find a mix of officers, volunteers, and park rangers coordinating the effort. The missing child was an 8-year-old boy who had wandered off during a family hike. Jake knelt beside Shadow, securing his harness and gently stroking his fur. "All right, buddy, he said. This is what we've trained for. Let's bring that boy home. Shadow's ears perked up, and his nose twitched as Jake held out a piece of the boy's clothing for him to sniff. Shadow sniffed it intently, his body tensing as he locked onto the scent. Go find him, Jake commanded, and Shadow took off, his movements confident and precise. The search was grueling. Shadow led Jake through thick underbrush and over uneven terrain, his nose working tirelessly to track the scent. Hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Jake's radio crackled with updates from other teams, but so far no one had found any sign of the boy. Jake's heart sank as he wondered if he had made the right decision bringing Shadow out so soon. But Shadow didn't falter. His tail wagged as he suddenly veered to the right, his nose low to the ground. Jake followed, adrenaline surging as Shadow's pace quickened. Then, in a small clearing, Shadow stopped and barked, a sharp, urgent sound that sent chills through Jake. He pushed through the bushes and saw the boy, curled up against a tree, shivering but alive. Jake dropped to his knees beside the boy, checking his pulse and breathing. You're okay, he said softly. We've got you. The boy opened his eyes, his face streaked with tears. I was so scared, he whispered. You're safe now, Jake said, his voice steady. Shadow found you. The boy's gaze shifted to Shadow, who was sitting nearby, his amber eyes focused on the child. The boy reached out, and Shadow leaned in, nuzzling his hand gently. By the time they returned to the search command center, cheers erupted as the boy was reunited with his family. Officers and volunteers gathered around Shadow, praising him for his heroism. Jake knelt beside his partner, his hand resting on Shadow's head. You did it, buddy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You saved him. Shadow wagged his tail, his eyes shining with pride. For Jake, this moment wasn't just about the boy's rescue. It was proof that Shadow was back, stronger and more determined than ever. That night, back at home, Jake sat on the porch with Shadow lying at his feet. The stars above twinkled softly, and the air was filled with the comforting sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. You've always been a hero, Shadow, Jake said, scratching behind his ears. But today, you reminded me why we do this, why we fight. You're incredible. Shadow let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping against the porch. Jake smiled, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Shadow wasn't just his partner. He was his family, his anchor, and his inspiration. As the night deepened, Jake leaned back, his heart full of hope. Their journey wasn't over, but together they could face anything. The following days were filled with quiet pride and reflection. The rescue at the state park had cemented Shadow's return, not just as a canine officer, but as a symbol of resilience and courage. For Jake, it was a moment that confirmed what he had known all along. Shadow wasn't just a partner, he was a fighter who refused to give up. Word of Shadow's heroic recovery and the rescue spread quickly. The precinct decided to honor him with a small ceremony, inviting officers, families, and even local media. Jake wasn't sure how Shadow would handle the crowd, but he wanted his partner to be recognized for everything he had endured and achieved. On the day of the ceremony, Jake prepared Shadow with care. He brushed his coat until it gleamed, adjusted his harness, and secured his canine badge to his collar. Shadow seemed to sense the importance of the occasion, standing tall and alert as they arrived at the precinct. The courtyard was filled with familiar faces, officers who had worked alongside Jake and Shadow, families who had followed their story, and even the family of the boy Shadow had saved. A banner stretched across the stage that read, "Honoring Shadow, a true hero." As Jake and Shadow approached the stage, the crowd erupted into applause. Shadow's ears perked up, and his tail wagged faintly as he looked around. Jake knelt beside him, whispering, "This is all for you, buddy. You earned it." Captain Avery stepped forward, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just a canine officer, but a true example of bravery, loyalty, and perseverance. Shadow has shown us what it means to fight through adversity and come out stronger. He's a hero in every sense of the word." The captain gestured for Jake and Shadow to join him on stage. As they stepped up, Jake felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Shadow stood proudly by his side, his amber eyes scanning the crowd as if acknowledging their support. Captain Avery handed Jake a medal, which he carefully placed around Shadow's neck. The crowd cheered, and several officers wiped away tears as they watched the dog who had come so close to death stand tall once more. When the applause died down, Jake stepped forward, gripping the microphone tightly. Shadow isn't just my partner, he's my family. He saved lives, brought hope, and taught me what it means to never give up. This medal is just a small reflection of the incredible work he's done and the impact he's had on all of us. Thank you for recognizing him today. The crowd erupted into applause again, and Shadow barked softly, his tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Jake knelt beside him, rubbing his ears. "You're a star now, buddy," he said with a grin. "But don't let it go to your head." After the ceremony, people lined up to meet Shadow. Children approached cautiously, and Shadow greeted them with a gentle nuzzle or a wag of his tail. Parents thanked Jake for Shadow's service, and fellow officers shared stories of the dog's many contributions over the years. Among the crowd was the family of the boy Shadow had rescued. The boy ran up to Shadow, hugging him tightly. "You saved me," he said, his voice trembling. "Thank you." Jake watched, his chest tightening with emotion. Shadow leaned into the boy, his calm demeanor speaking volumes about his understanding of the moment. The boy's parents approached Jake, shaking his hand firmly. "We'll never forget what you and Shadow did for us," the father said. "You gave us our son back." Later that evening, back at home, Jake and Shadow sat on the porch, the medal gleaming in the soft light of the setting sun. Shadow rested his head on Jake's lap, his body relaxed and his eyes half closed in contentment. "You did good today," Jake said softly, stroking Shadow's fur. "You remind people that no matter how hard things get, there's always a reason to keep going." Shadow let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping lightly against the wooden porch. Jake leaned back, his heart full of gratitude for the journey they had shared. As the stars appeared in the night sky, Jake made a silent promise. He would honor Shadow's legacy every day, not just as a canine officer, but as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond they shared. The months that followed the ceremony were some of the happiest Jake could remember. Shadow had fully recovered, and their partnership was stronger than ever. Together, they returned to active duty, continuing to make a difference in their community. But their bond had deepened beyond the usual handler and dog relationship. Shadow wasn't just a partner, he was family. One brisk autumn morning, Jake and Shadow were called to a local school for a special presentation. The principal had invited them to speak to the students about bravery and teamwork, using Shadow's incredible story as inspiration. As Jake stood before a room full of wide-eyed children, he couldn't help but smile at their fascination with Shadow. The German Shepherd sat proudly beside him, his canine badge shining under the classroom lights, his amber eyes scanning the room with calm authority. "Shadow isn't just a police dog," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "He's a hero. A few months ago, Shadow was critically injured in the line of duty, but he didn't give up. He fought through pain, fear, and uncertainty to come back stronger than ever. And today, he's here to show you that no matter how hard life gets, you can always fight your way back." The children listened intently, their faces filled with awe. One boy raised his hand. "What makes Shadow so brave?" he asked. Jake knelt beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears. "It's his heart," Jake replied. "Shadow doesn't think about fear. He thinks about protecting the people he loves, and that's what makes him special." After the presentation, the children gathered around Shadow, petting him and asking Jake questions. Shadow, ever patient, wagged his tail and nuzzled the children gently, his calm demeanor putting everyone at ease. Jake watched with pride, knowing that Shadow's story was leaving a lasting impact on these young minds. Later that evening, as Jake and Shadow returned home, the air was crisp and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. They sat on the porch, watching the sunset together. Shadow rested his head on Jake's knee, his body relaxed but his eyes still alert, as if always ready to protect. "You've changed so many lives, buddy," Jake said softly, his hand resting on Shadow's head. "Not just mine, but everyone who hears your story. You remind people what it means to be brave, loyal, and strong." Shadow let out a soft huff, his tail thumping gently against the wooden porch. Jake chuckled, his heart full of gratitude. In that moment, Jake realized that Shadow's legacy was more than just his heroism. It was the bond they shared, a connection built on trust, love, and mutual respect. Together, they had faced the unthinkable and come out stronger. And together, they would continue to inspire others, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope and resilience could shine through. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jake leaned back and closed his eyes, his hand still resting on Shadow's head. "You're my hero, Shadow," he whispered. "Always." Shadow shifted slightly, his body pressing closer to Jake's side. His amber eyes glowed softly in the moonlight, a silent promise that their bond would endure, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Shadow's story is a powerful reminder of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their canine partners. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales of loyalty and strength. Let's keep celebrating the incredible heroes, both human and canine, who make the world a better place. Thank you for watching.